The waters of Iron Bottom Sound ran dark under the star-filled sky that early morning in November of 1942. Commander Tamichi Hara stood on the bridge of his destroyer, hands gripping the cold metal railing as brilliant white light suddenly flooded across his ship. Star shells had burst overhead, painting everything in harsh illumination that made his crew squint and shield their eyes. Hara had spent 2 full decades in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and every one of those years had reinforced a single truth that every officer knew down to his bones. The Japanese owned the night. Night combat was their art, their specialty, their guarantee of victory against enemies who outnumbered them. But something was happening in these waters that made no sense according to everything Hara had been taught. American shells were landing around Amatsukaze with terrifying accuracy. The enemy was firing from distances that exceeded 10,000 yards, hitting his ship again and again in the pitch darkness, and their shells arrived with a mechanical precision that seemed impossible. There were no searchlights cutting through the night to give away the American positions. No star shells preceded their salvos to illuminate their targets. The destroyer USS Helena had found Amatsukaze with something Hara didn't yet understand, and when he kept his own searchlights burning too long in a desperate attempt to locate his attackers, those American 6-inch guns killed 43 of his men in a matter of minutes. The shells came out of nowhere, from an enemy he couldn't see, guided by technology that shouldn't exist. 3 kilometers away through the darkness, the massive battleship Hiei was taking concentrated fire from ships that her lookouts couldn't locate no matter how hard they strained their eyes. This was the pride of the Imperial Fleet, a veteran warship that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, and she was being systematically destroyed by enemies who were fighting from beyond visual range. What none of the Japanese officers present that night yet comprehended was that they were witnessing the operational deployment of something called the SG Surface Search Radar, a piece of technology that would completely transform how naval battles were fought and would utterly destroy Japan's most crucial tactical advantage in less than 18 months. The mathematics of Japan's defeat weren't going to be calculated in the number of ships lost or the amount of territory surrendered. Instead, the calculation was happening in the sudden and complete obsolescence of 20 years' worth of training, doctrine, and national strategy that had all been built on one fundamental assumption that seemed unshakable. The Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night, and that ownership was supposed to guarantee victory. But the Americans had changed the rules of the game with technology that made darkness irrelevant. The Imperial Navy's expertise in night combat hadn't appeared overnight. It had been carefully cultivated and refined since the Russo-Japanese War that ran from 1904 through 1905. During the Battle of Tsushima, Admiral Togo's torpedo boats had achieved devastating success against the Russian fleet by attacking under cover of darkness. That victory became sacred text for the Imperial Navy, establishing night combat as the absolute cornerstone of Japanese naval strategy for defeating enemies who had more ships and more resources. By the time 1942 rolled around, this doctrine had evolved into what was unquestionably the most sophisticated night fighting system anywhere in the world. Japanese sailors didn't just practice occasionally in the dark. They trained relentlessly, constantly, obsessively in darkness. The lookouts underwent specialized programs specifically designed to enhance their ability to see at night. They spent countless hours sitting in darkened rooms, their eyes adjusting to minimal light. Their diets were carefully controlled to avoid vitamin A deficiencies that could damage night vision. They practiced estimating distances in low light conditions until they could do it automatically without conscious thought. The average Japanese lookout could spot the silhouette of a ship at 7,000 meters on a moonless night. That was twice the distance that their American counterparts could manage, and every Japanese officer knew it. The technology gap seemed to confirm everything the Japanese believed about their superiority. While America relied on primitive radar sets that most captains didn't trust and didn't really know how to use effectively, Japanese optical equipment led the entire world. Their binoculars were manufactured by Nippon Kogaku, a company that would later become known as Nikon, and these instruments provided exceptional magnification with light-gathering capability that was simply superior to anything the Americans had. The Type 93 long-lance torpedoes that Japanese destroyers carried could strike targets at 24,000 yards, far beyond any range at which American ships could detect them at night using their eyes alone. Everything that happened in the early part of the Pacific War seemed to validate every single assumption the Japanese had made about night combat. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, Japanese cruisers had absolutely annihilated an Allied force in just 33 minutes of night combat, sending 4 heavy cruisers to the bottom without losing a single ship of their own. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, a single Japanese destroyer squadron would savage a superior American cruiser force, putting torpedoes into 4 ships within minutes. The Japanese didn't just win these battles. They dominated them completely, and the Americans seemed helpless in the darkness. What the Imperial Navy didn't know, what they had no way of knowing, was that a revolution in radar technology was taking place in American shipyards and laboratories. The SG Surface Search Radar had been developed under guidance from the MIT Radiation Laboratory and the Naval Research Laboratory, and it represented a quantum leap forward from the primitive sets that had failed so spectacularly at Savo Island. Operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength with a power output of 50 kilowatts, the SG radar could detect a destroyer at 15 nautical miles and track it with enough accuracy to enable blind firing at 10 miles. The system worked perfectly whether it was day or night, clear weather or storms, smoke or fog. None of those conditions made any difference whatsoever to the radar. The MIT Radiation Laboratory had been established in November of 1940, and by 1943 it had grown to employ nearly 4,000 people. The foundation of all their work was something called the cavity magnetron, which had been delivered to America by the British Tizard mission in September of 1940. The historian James Finney Baxter III would later call this device the most valuable cargo ever brought to American shores, and he wasn't exaggerating. This single piece of technology enabled the production of approximately 1,000 SG radar sets during the course of the war, and each one of those sets gave American ships capabilities that seemed like science fiction to Japanese observers. The first Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Fletcher, with the designation DD-445, was commissioned on June 30, 1942, and she carried this revolutionary radar system as standard equipment right from the start. By November of 1942, Fletcher herself was operating in the Solomon Islands, though she would be the only Fletcher-class destroyer present at the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The plan position indicator, known as the PPI scope, provided operators with a god's-eye view of the entire battle space. All contacts appeared on a circular screen that updated every 2 seconds, giving a constantly refreshed picture of everything happening around the ship. Operators could distinguish between different ship types by examining their radar returns. They could track torpedo wakes. They could even spot submarines at periscope depth under the right conditions. The SG radar was integrated with the Mark 37 gun director, which was linked to an analog computer that could calculate firing solutions in mere seconds. The computer automatically adjusted for target speed, target course, wind conditions, and the motion of the firing ship itself. The 5-inch 38 caliber guns that were standard armament on Fletcher-class destroyers could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute, and every single one of those rounds could be directed with radar-guided accuracy. The Japanese had nothing remotely comparable to this level of technological integration. The night that ran from November 12th into November 13th of 1942 would mark the beginning of the shattering of Japanese assumptions about night combat superiority. The naval battle of Guadalcanal began when Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force intercepted Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment group as it approached Henderson Field. While only USS Fletcher represented the new destroyer class in this battle, several ships in the American force carried SG radar, including USS Helena. At precisely 124 hours, Helena's SG radar detected Japanese ships at 27,000 yards, a distance far beyond anything the human eye could possibly see in the darkness. For the next 20 minutes, American radar operators tracked the approaching Japanese force with perfect clarity, while Japanese lookouts strained futilely into the darkness, seeing nothing but black water and black sky. When the battle finally descended into chaos, American radar-directed fire disrupted Japanese formations before they could employ any of their superior night-fighting tactics that they'd spent decades perfecting. The destroyer Akatsuki, attempting to execute her specialized night torpedo attack run, was caught in radar-directed crossfire from multiple American ships simultaneously. She exploded and sank within minutes, her crew never understanding what had hit them. Commander Hara on Amatsukaze experienced this new reality firsthand in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His ship successfully torpedoed USS Barton, breaking her in half and sending her straight to the bottom. His torpedoes also hit USS Juno, leaving her crippled and dead in the water. These were victories using traditional Japanese tactics, and they should have felt triumphant. But when Hara illuminated USS San Francisco with his searchlights to improve his gunnery accuracy, Helena's radar-directed guns immediately found Amatsukaze in the darkness. The shells came screaming in with devastating accuracy, causing severe damage to his ship and killing many of his crew. Hara had made himself visible to find his enemy, and the Americans had destroyed his ship without ever needing to see it with their eyes. The battleship Hiei, which served as Admiral Abe's flagship, became the primary focus of American radar-directed fire. In darkness and rain squalls that should have provided perfect concealment according to every principle of naval warfare that the Japanese understood, Hiei absorbed 85 shell hits from enemies who were firing at ranges beyond Japanese visual capability. Her bridge was wrecked, her steering was destroyed, and her superstructure was set ablaze. She would be scuttled the following day, becoming the first Japanese battleship lost in the entire war. The psychological impact of losing a battleship to invisible enemies in the darkness was devastating to Japanese naval morale. The disparity between Japanese and American night-fighting capabilities became increasingly apparent as the battles continued through late 1942 and into early 1943. The American SG radar operated at 3 GHz with 50 kilowatts of peak power. It could detect destroyers at 15 nautical miles or more, with accuracy of plus or minus 40 yards in range and plus or minus half a degree in bearing. The entire system weighed 1,000 pounds and had an operational availability rate of 95%, which made it practical for widespread deployment across the fleet. Every ship that had it could count on it working when needed. In stark contrast, the Japanese Type 22 radar operated at only 150 MHz with a pathetic 2 kilowatts of peak power. Under optimal conditions, which rarely existed in actual combat, it could detect destroyers at 10 nautical miles. Its accuracy was plus or minus 300 yards in range and plus or minus 5 degrees in bearing, which was completely inadequate for directing gunfire. The system weighed 2,200 pounds, making it cumbersome and difficult to install, and it had an operational availability rate of only 40%. Of the first 60 Type 22 sets that were built, only about 6 actually worked properly. Total Japanese radar production during the entire war reached only about 300 units, which was less than 1/3 of American SG radar production alone. The technological gap reflected much deeper organizational problems within the Japanese military-industrial complex. Japan had actually developed cavity magnetrons by 1937, years before the war started. Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi had invented the directional antenna that would eventually bear his name all the way back in 1926. Yet when it came time to develop radar systems, the military leadership excluded Yagi from the work entirely. When Japanese forces later captured British radar equipment that used Yagi antennas, they were completely unaware that the design they were looking at had been invented by a Japanese scientist. The bitter irony was lost on them. Army-Navy rivalry within the Japanese military prevented any meaningful coordination between the services. Both the Army and the Navy developed separate radar systems that were completely incompatible with each other. Resources were duplicated, efforts were wasted, and the final products from both services were inferior to what the Americans were deploying. During the Battle of Vella La Vella on October 6th and 7th of 1943, USS Selfridge detected and tracked Long Lance torpedoes using radar, which allowed the ship to evade weapons that had been invariably lethal in earlier battles. The Japanese ultimate weapon, the torpedo that was supposed to guarantee victory, could now be seen and avoided. The Fletcher-class destroyer's radar advantage extended far beyond simple detection capabilities. It provided complete tactical superiority in every aspect of night combat. The Tokyo Express runs, which were high-speed destroyer missions to resupply Guadalcanal, had depended entirely on Japanese night-fighting superiority. These missions were conducted by the finest destroyer captains in the Imperial Navy, men who had spent their entire careers perfecting their craft. But they began suffering increasing losses to radar-equipped American ships that could find them in any weather, in any conditions, at any time. Captain Raizo Tanaka commanded the 2nd Destroyer Squadron and led many of the Tokyo Express runs. He would later write about the growing American radar advantage in his 1956 article for the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings titled Japan's Losing Struggle for Guadalcanal. Though Tanaka's own tactical brilliance had achieved a stunning success at Tassafaronga, he recognized with the clear eyes of a professional that darkness no longer provided any protection against American technology. By early 1943, American destroyers were intercepting Tokyo Express runs in complete darkness, in rain, in squall conditions that should have made detection impossible. The Americans fired first, they fired accurately, and they pursued Japanese forces even when those forces fled at full speed into the night. The night of November 25, 1943, demonstrated the complete reversal of tactical advantage in a way that left no room for doubt. 5 destroyers under Captain Arleigh Burke intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers off Cape St. George. In a running battle that was fought entirely by radar, Burke's squadron sank 3 Japanese destroyers named Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri without taking any significant damage in return. The Japanese ships never achieved visual contact with their attackers. They were fighting blind against an enemy who could see perfectly, and the outcome was never in doubt. This would be the last surface engagement in the Solomon Islands, marking the end of major surface combat in that area of operations. By mid-1943, Japanese naval commanders were desperately trying to adapt to the new reality, but they were working without the tools they needed. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in April of 1943 removed the one leader who might have best understood the implications of American technological superiority. Yamamoto had studied in the United States and had seen American industrial capacity firsthand. He might have pushed for the kind of radical changes that were needed, but with him gone, the Imperial Navy continued trying to fight the war using outdated doctrines. Japanese attempts to counter American radar proved completely futile. They deployed rudimentary radar countermeasures consisting of aluminum strips that they called gimanshi, which meant deception paper. But these proved totally ineffective against the sophisticated SG radar systems. Japanese radar development, which was hampered by inter-service rivalry and severe resource constraints, remained years behind American technology, with no realistic hope of catching up. The industrial base simply didn't exist to mass-produce the components that were needed. Commander Tamichi Hara, who would survive the war as the only IJN destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to do so, would later write in his memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain about the growing realization among Japanese officers that their night-fighting expertise had become completely obsolete. Though his memoir contains some factual errors, which is common in personal accounts written years after events, his assessment of American technological superiority was entirely accurate. The men who had spent their lives perfecting night combat watched helplessly as all their skills became worthless. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of how radar had fundamentally transformed naval combat. Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill's Task Force 39, which included several Fletcher-class destroyers equipped with the latest SG radar modifications, intercepted a superior Japanese force under Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori. At 02:27 hours, the Americans achieved radar contact at 35,900 yards, giving them complete tactical advantage before the battle even began. For the next several hours, American ships tracked the approaching enemy with perfect clarity, maneuvering into optimal firing positions while remaining completely invisible to Japanese lookouts. The American destroyers demonstrated capabilities that seemed absolutely supernatural to the Japanese observers who survived. Ships engaged targets at ranges exceeding 14,000 yards in total darkness, scoring hits with their very first salvos. They detected and evaded long-lance torpedoes by tracking the wakes of those torpedoes on radar, then counterattacked the destroyers that had launched them without ever making visual contact. The battle's outcome shocked the Japanese High Command when the reports came in. Despite having superior numbers and firepower, Omori's force was utterly routed. The light cruiser Sendai and destroyer Hatsukaze were lost, while the Japanese inflicted only minimal damage on the American force. Samuel Eliot Morison, the naval historian, noted that this battle marked the definitive end of Japan's previous advantage in night engagement. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel transcended mere tactical defeat. These were men who had spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting their night fighting skills. They had trained harder and longer than anyone else in the world. They had believed completely in their superiority, and that belief had been validated by early victories. Now they watched helplessly as technology rendered all of their expertise worthless. The erosion of morale was documented in Japanese operational reports that became increasingly pessimistic as 1943 wore on. The vaunted long-lance torpedoes, launched at radar-guided estimates of enemy positions, increasingly found only empty water. The Americans could see the torpedoes coming and simply move out of the way. Elite destroyer crews that had considered themselves absolute masters of night combat found themselves completely helpless against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't find, couldn't engage. The frustration and demoralization were profound and deeply damaging to Japanese naval effectiveness. The Fletcher-class production program represented American industrial might operating at its absolute zenith. Between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards produced exactly 175 Fletcher-class destroyers. That was more destroyers than Japan built of all types during the entire war. Every single one of those American ships carried radar systems that were more sophisticated than anything in the Japanese fleet. The SG radar sets were manufactured by Western Electric, Westinghouse, and General Electric at production rates that defied Japanese comprehension. The magnetron tubes that formed the heart of the radar system, which were impossible for Japan to manufacture reliably, were mass-produced in American factories like any other component. By the time the war ended, the United States had produced over 100,000 radar sets of all types. The disparity extended far beyond mere production numbers. American radar technology improved continuously throughout the war. The SG radar evolved through multiple versions, with each iteration increasing range, improving accuracy, and enhancing target discrimination. By 1944, American destroyers carried radar systems that could detect a surfaced submarine at 18 miles and track a periscope at 3 miles. Meanwhile, Japanese radar development essentially stagnated. The Naval Electrical Research Department had only 300 staff members by August of 1943, compared to the MIT Radiation Laboratory's 4,000 employees. Critical components required materials that Japan simply couldn't obtain because of the Allied blockade. Most crucially, Japan completely lacked the vast electronics industry that supported American radar development and production. As radar negated all of their traditional night fighting tactics, The Imperial Navy desperately sought new doctrines that might restore some measure of effectiveness. Orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters began acknowledging American radar superiority explicitly, something that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The new orders emphasized radical maneuvering and the acceptance of much higher casualties. These orders represented complete capitulation to American technological superiority, though nobody would use those exact words. The Imperial Navy that had once actively sought night battles now actively avoided them whenever possible. When Japanese forces were forced to fight at night, they employed tactics that accepted severe losses for even the possibility of achieving torpedo launch positions. It was a desperate gamble every time. Training programs struggled desperately to adapt to the new reality. The torpedo school at Yokosuka attempted to develop blind launch techniques, with crews firing spreads of torpedoes at calculated positions without any visual contact with the enemy. Success rates were minimal, and the waste of precious torpedoes was appalling. The Naval War College developed new night fighting doctrines that were based entirely on accepting catastrophic casualties. It was a doctrine born of desperation rather than any realistic hope of success. Even Japan's submarine force, which had initially been less affected by American radar superiority because submarines operated differently from surface ships, soon encountered the full reach of the technology. Fleet submarines that attempted to recharge their batteries on the surface at night discovered that darkness no longer provided any safety at all. The SG radar could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges exceeding 15 miles, far beyond visual range even in perfect daylight conditions. Japanese submarines, which were dependent on surface running for both speed and battery charging, found their operational effectiveness completely crippled. Transit speeds dropped catastrophically from 15 knots on the surface to 3 knots submerged. Battery life limited underwater endurance to just hours rather than days. American destroyer escorts equipped with radar hunted Japanese submarines with deadly efficiency that the Japanese had never experienced before. The USS England sank 6 Japanese submarines in just 12 days during May of 1944, with all of them detected initially by radar. Japanese submarine losses reached absolutely catastrophic levels by late 1944, with boats simply disappearing without trace as radar-equipped American escorts found them on the surface at night. Japanese naval officers began drawing parallels between their radar disadvantage and the B-29 bombing campaign that was devastating their homeland. Just as American bombers struck from altitudes that were beyond the reach of Japanese interceptors, American destroyers struck from beyond visual range. Technology had created sanctuary from which Americans could attack without any risk to themselves. The psychological parallel was exact and deeply disturbing. Fighter pilots who watched B-29s cruise overhead beyond their ceiling experienced the same sense of utter helplessness as destroyer crews being shelled by invisible enemies. Traditional warrior skills meant nothing. Courage meant nothing. Training meant nothing. Spirit meant nothing. All that mattered was technology, and the Americans had it while Japan did not. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 provided the final devastating confirmation of radar's complete transformation of naval warfare. The largest naval battle in history became a technological mismatch that demonstrated American superiority in every phase. During the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, the destroyer USS Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans engaged Japanese battleships using radar-directed fire in rain squalls and smoke that made visual targeting impossible. Despite being vastly outgunned by ships many times her size, Johnston fought with devastating effectiveness because she could see when her enemies were blind. In Surigao Strait, American destroyers launched perfectly coordinated torpedo attacks from beyond visual range, guided entirely by radar. The battleship Fuso was torpedoed and sunk by destroyers that her crew never saw. Japanese forces entered the strait piecemeal and were destroyed systematically by radar-directed fire from ships they couldn't locate. It was slaughter conducted with scientific precision. The Battle of Vella Gulf on August 6th and 7th of 1943 had already demonstrated the complete dominance that radar provided. On November 25th of 1943, Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23, known as the Little Beavers, achieved another perfect radar victory at Cape St. George. Burke's ships detected 5 Japanese destroyers at 14,100 yards, tracked them while remaining undetected themselves, and launched devastating attacks. 3 Japanese destroyers named Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri were sunk with 647 Japanese sailors killed. American losses were 0 casualties and 0 damage. It was the kind of lopsided victory that happens when one side can see perfectly and the other side is completely blind. Burke's after-action report was clinical in its precision. The entire engagement had been conducted by radar plot. Visual contact with the enemy was never achieved, nor was it required for complete victory. This single battle convinced Japanese naval leadership at the highest levels that night surface combat was simply no longer viable against radar-equipped American forces. It marked the last surface engagement of the Solomon Islands campaign and effectively ended Japanese attempts to use destroyer forces in night combat operations. American production figures revealed the true technological gulf between the two nations in ways that were simply staggering. The United States produced 175 Fletcher-class destroyers between 1942 and 1944. Approximately 1,000 SG radar sets were manufactured and installed. Over 100,000 radar sets of all types were produced. 250,000 cavity magnetrons came off American production lines. By 1944, American factories were producing 2.5 million radio tubes every single month. The disparity exceeded 50-1 in crucial areas. America had more radar sets installed on destroyers alone than Japan produced for all purposes combined. Every single Fletcher-class destroyer represented industrial capacity that Japan wouldn't achieve for decades to come. Japanese naval training programs never successfully adapted to the radar age because they simply couldn't. The infrastructure built up over 20 years of night vision training, lookout schools, and optical ranging systems had become obsolete overnight, but it couldn't be replaced with anything better. The few Japanese radar sets that were available were both primitive and unreliable. The Type 22 surface search radar, when it actually worked, had less than half the capability of the American SG radar. More critically, it completely lacked the discrimination needed to separate multiple targets or to direct accurate gunfire. It used only an A-scope display that showed range as a spike on a line, rather than the revolutionary PPI scope that showed all contacts on a map-like display that made tactical sense at a glance. Training Japanese sailors on these inferior radar sets actually proved counterproductive in many cases. Officers learned to distrust radar after experiencing multiple failures and malfunctions, so they returned to visual methods despite those methods being completely inadequate against American technology. It was a vicious cycle that had no good solution given Japan's industrial limitations. The waters around Guadalcanal earned the nickname Iron Bottom Sound because of all the ships resting on the seafloor there. These waters became the laboratory where radar warfare was perfected through trial and combat. The evolution of Japanese losses during night engagements tells the story in stark numbers. During August and September of 1942, Japanese losses were nearly equal to American losses. In October and November of 1942, Japanese losses were double those of the Americans. From December 1942 through January of 1943, Japanese losses were triple American losses. From February of 1943 onward, Japanese losses became catastrophic, while American losses remained minimal. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had lost 40 destroyers in just 16 months, according to U.S. Naval Institute sources. The night fighting advantage that had been the absolute cornerstone of Japanese naval strategy was completely reversed. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was rooted in samurai tradition and the concept of personal combat excellence, The radar revolution represented nothing less than cultural catastrophe. The fundamental premise that technology could replace warrior skill contradicted everything that Japanese military philosophy held sacred. Young Japanese officers who had been raised on tales of samurai valor and personal combat prowess struggled desperately to comprehend a form of warfare where the enemy was invisible and completely unreachable. The radar gap challenged Japanese racial theories that had portrayed Americans as spiritually weak and dependent on technology precisely because they lacked true warrior courage. Japanese attempts to counter American radar revealed both considerable ingenuity and complete futility. The deployment of Window, which was essentially chaff made of aluminum strips, proved totally ineffective against sophisticated American radar systems. Electronic warfare attempts failed completely because Japan lacked the electronic industry needed to produce jamming equipment in any useful quantities. The Japanese attempted various tactical solutions, including special paints that were supposed to reduce radar reflection, but extensive tests proved these to be only marginally effective at best. By mid-1944, the Naval Technical Department had essentially given up on any realistic hope of matching American radar technology. The adoption of kamikaze tactics in October of 1944 represented Japan's response to comprehensive defeat across multiple dimensions, though it wasn't specifically a response to radar disadvantage. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized the first official kamikaze unit on October 19, 1944, at Mabalacat in the Philippines. His stated reason for creating this unit was that with only 40 operational aircraft and poorly trained pilots remaining, conventional attacks had become completely futile. The documented factors behind the kamikaze decision included catastrophic pilot losses that couldn't be replaced, severe training deficiencies because experienced instructors were dead, loss of air superiority across the entire theatre, and crippling resource shortages. Radar disadvantage was never cited in any contemporary documents as a factor in adopting suicide tactics. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred on October 25, 1944, which coincidentally was the same day as the Battle off Samar, but these attacks were driven by desperation over pilot quality and aircraft availability rather than any concerns about radar. Statistics from Pacific destroyer engagements starkly illustrated radar's transformational impact when examined across different time periods. In the pre-radar era from December 1941 through October of 1942, Japanese destroyers lost 18 ships in night combat, while American destroyers lost 25 ships. The exchange ratio was 1.4 to 1 favoring Japan. In the early radar era from November 1942 through June of 1943, Japanese destroyers lost 19 ships in night combat, while Americans lost only 7. The exchange ratio had reversed to 2.7 to 1 favoring America. In the mature radar era, from July 1943 through August of 1945, Japanese destroyers lost 47 ships in night combat, while Americans lost only 4. The exchange ratio had become 11.8 to 1 favoring America. The technical superiority of American radar systems exceeded Japanese capabilities by literal orders of magnitude. The American SG radar operated at 3 GHz frequency with 10 cm wavelength. Its power output was 50 kilowatts. Against destroyer-sized targets, it had a range of 15 nautical miles or more. Its range accuracy was plus or minus 40 yards. Its bearing accuracy was plus or minus half a degree. It used a PPI display that showed all contacts clearly. Approximately 1,000 units were produced in total. In stark contrast, the Japanese Type 22 radar operated at 150 MHz frequency with 2-meter wavelength. Its power output was a pathetic 2 kilowatts. Against destroyer-sized targets, it had a range of only 10 nautical miles under optimal conditions. Its range accuracy was plus or minus 300 yards. Its bearing accuracy was plus or minus 5 degrees. It used only an A-scope display that was difficult to interpret. Only approximately 300 units were produced in total. The specifications revealed technological generations of difference between American and Japanese systems. American radar operated at frequencies that provided vastly better resolution. It used magnetron tubes that Japan simply couldn't manufacture reliably, despite having invented them earlier. It integrated seamlessly with fire control systems that Japan hadn't developed. Captured Japanese equipment and post-war interrogations of survivors revealed the true depth of the technological gap. Japanese forces had actually captured examples of British cavity magnetrons early in the war, but they couldn't reverse engineer them successfully or manufacture them at scale. When they captured radar sets equipped with Yagi antennas, they didn't realize these antennas were named after a Japanese inventor named Hidetsugu Yagi, whom their own military had ignored and excluded from radar work. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers, and those interviews found universal agreement that radar had transformed naval warfare beyond Japanese ability to adapt. Officers testified that by 1943 they understood the radar gap completely, but they suppressed this knowledge to maintain crew morale. There was no point in telling sailors that they were fighting blind against an enemy who could see perfectly. The Battle of Cape St. George on November 25th of 1943 served as the epitaph for Japanese night fighting superiority. Captain Arleigh Burke's destroyer Squadron 23 achieved perfect victory through radar alone, sinking 3 Japanese destroyers without any losses. This battle convinced Japanese naval leadership at the very highest levels that night surface combat was no longer viable under any circumstances. Orders from Combined Fleet essentially abandoned night destroyer actions entirely, acknowledging explicitly that night combat advantage now belonged entirely to the enemy. It was an admission of defeat that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The MIT Radiation Laboratory deserves special recognition for its role in revolutionizing naval warfare. The laboratory was established in November of 1940 under Dr. Lee Dubridge, and it grew to employ nearly 4,000 people at its peak. The lab designed half of all radar systems deployed by United States forces during the war. The lab's work went far beyond just the SG radar, ultimately developing over 100 different microwave systems worth $1.5 billion in total production value. The foundation of everything the lab accomplished was that British cavity magnetron delivered in the TESAD mission of September 1940. This single device, which produced 1 kilowatt of power at 10 centimeters wavelength, was 100 times more powerful than any existing technology. The Americans took what the British had invented, mass-produced it at scales the British couldn't achieve, and deployed it in systems that the Japanese couldn't replicate. 9 staff members from the radiation laboratory would later win Nobel Prizes for their scientific work, but their wartime contribution was enabling the electronic revolution that transformed naval combat from visual engagement at close range to radar-directed warfare at extreme distances. The radar revolution forced fundamental changes in naval doctrine that persist to this very day. Every modern navy in the world acknowledges that electronic detection has completely superseded visual observation as the primary means of conducting naval combat. The United States Naval War College published a study in 1947 that concluded future naval combat will be determined entirely by electronic capabilities rather than traditional seamanship. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, which was established in the 1950s after the war, built its founding principles directly on lessons learned from the radar war. Electronic warfare capability became the foundation, and all other considerations became secondary to achieving sensor superiority. Japanese technical officers who understood radar's implications early in the war were systematically ignored by operational commanders who were wedded to traditional doctrine and didn't want to hear bad news. The few officers who had training in electronics became prophets without honor, predicting defeat while being dismissed by leadership that absolutely refused to acknowledge technological reality. This disconnect between technical understanding and operational doctrine proved fatal to Japanese naval effectiveness. While American forces integrated radar into every single aspect of naval operations, Japanese commanders continued planning visual range night attacks even as their ships were being destroyed from beyond sight. The final measure of radar's impact came from comparative loss statistics that told an undeniable story. The reversal was complete and total. Radar had transformed night combat from a Japanese advantage into complete American dominance. The weapon that Japan had perfected over decades of intensive effort was turned against them with technology they couldn't match. By war's end, of the 70 modern destroyers that Japan possessed at the time of Pearl Harbor, only about a dozen remained operational. The Imperial Japanese Navy that had entered the war as undisputed masters of night combat ended the war unable to venture out after darkness fell. Commander Tamichi Hara, who was the only Japanese destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to survive the entire war, published his memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain in 1961. While the memoir contains some factual errors that are inevitable in personal accounts written years after events, his assessment of the radar war stands as the most comprehensive first-hand account from the Japanese perspective that exists. Hara participated in 16 major naval battles and witnessed the complete transformation of naval warfare with his own eyes. His ship Amatsukaze survived the November 13, 1942 battle, despite taking severe damage from Helena's radar-directed guns. He later commanded the cruiser Yahagi and finally the destroyer Shigur, surviving battles where most of his fellow captains died. In his memoir, Hara criticized Japanese leadership harshly for failing to appreciate the speed with which the enemy could develop new weapons and for never understanding the implications of rapid technological change. He survived to see the Imperial Navy's night fighting supremacy completely reversed by American radar technology. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who had commanded the Tokyo Express runs with such skill and determination, published his own assessment in 1956 in an article titled Japan's Losing Struggle for Guadalcanal in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. He acknowledged without equivocation that American radar had fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare, making all traditional Japanese night fighting tactics completely obsolete. There was no bitterness in his assessment, only professional recognition of technological reality. The radar war forced a philosophical reckoning within Japanese military culture that went far beyond simple tactical adjustments. The fundamental premise of Bushido, the warrior code, was that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage through courage and dedication. This premise was utterly shattered by oscilloscopes and magnetrons that cared nothing for courage or spirit. Post-war Japanese military philosophy had to reconcile traditional warrior culture with the harsh realities of technological warfare. The lesson that emerged was absolute and unforgiving. In modern war, technology is not supplementary, but supreme. Those who see first will win. Those who see farthest will dominate. Courage and spirit remain important, but they cannot overcome technological inferiority. The final accounting of the radar war in the Pacific provides stark quantification of a technological revolution that changed everything. 175 Fletcher-class destroyers were produced. Approximately 1,000 SG radar sets were manufactured and deployed. Over 100,000 radar sets of all types were built. Japanese night vision advantage was negated completely and permanently. These numbers tell the story of a revolution that transformed naval warfare in less than 2 years. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had spent decades perfecting night combat into an art form, was defeated by technology that didn't even exist when their training programs began. The Fletcher-class destroyers with their SG radar sets achieved something unprecedented in military history. They completely negated an enemy's primary tactical advantage through pure technological superiority. Japanese night fighting expertise, which had been carefully cultivated since 1904, was rendered utterly worthless by magnetrons and oscilloscopes that were mass-produced in American factories. Commander Tameichi Hara's survival through 16 major battles gave him a unique perspective on this transformation that few others possessed. From commanding a Matsukaze at Guadalcanal, where he first encountered American radar in combat, to commanding Shigur when it was the sole survivor at Vela Gulf, he witnessed the complete reversal of naval warfare with his own eyes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war supremely confident that superior night fighting skills would offset American material advantages in ship numbers and industrial production. By war's end, radar had proven beyond any doubt that technological superiority could completely negate human skill, training, and tradition. The Fletcher-class destroyers with their SG radar sets hadn't just won the destroyer war in the Pacific. They had fundamentally transformed naval warfare from an art based on human skill to a science based on electronic detection, from warrior tradition to technological superiority. The Japanese officers who survived the war understood a fundamental truth that would shape all future warfare. The age of visual naval combat had ended forever in the waters around Guadalcanal, replaced permanently by electronic warfare that cared absolutely nothing for courage, tradition, or the warrior spirit. These men had been the undisputed masters of night combat, perfecting their skills across decades of intensive training and real combat experience. But in just 18 months, American radar turned their hard-won mastery into obsolescence, their expertise into irrelevance, and their night-fighting advantage into a fatal liability that killed them. The darkness that had been their greatest ally, the element they had owned completely, became their tomb. The Americans who wielded radar technology became the undisputed masters of the night, and the Japanese could do nothing to stop them. The revolution was complete, irreversible, and absolutely devastating. In the end, those who could see won every battle, and those who remained blind to technological change were condemned to inevitable defeat in the darkness they had once ruled without challenge.